You're going to marry him, Vanessa. That's not a request. Richard Caldwell placed a photograph on his mahogany desk, a black man in a worn flannel shirt holding a little girl against his chest. The man wasn't smiling. His eyes carried something heavier than sadness. Vanessa stared at the photo, then at her father. You want me to marry a stranger. I want you to honor a promise that saved this family. She picked up the photograph. The man looked nothing like the world she knew, and that she realized was exactly why her father had chosen him. The photograph stayed in Vanessa's hand long after she left her father's office. She carried it to her penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, set it against an unopened bottle of wine on the kitchen island, and stared at it the way she used to stare at acquisition proposals, searching for the flaw, the angle, the thing that didn't add up. Henry Thompson. She didn't know his name yet when she first looked at the picture. All she saw was a man in a worn flannel shirt, standing in front of a small house that needed paint, holding a little girl against his chest, like she was the only thing in the world worth protecting. The porch railing behind them was crooked. The yard was modest. But the way his cheek rested against his daughter's hair, that wasn't modest. That was something vast, something Vanessa recognized but couldn't name, because no one had ever held her that way. Her father had explained everything with the precision of a man who had spent 50 years making deals. 23 years ago, Caldwell Industries had been 6 weeks from collapse. Every bank had refused him. Every investor had demanded terms that would have gutted the company. And then James Thompson, a plumber from Detroit who had saved every dollar he'd ever earned, had walked into Richard's office and written a cashier's check for $350,000. No interest, no equity stake. Just one condition that their children would marry one day, binding the two families together. James had died the previous year. Pancreatic cancer. He never saw the promise kept. You can't expect me to marry a stranger because of a handshake from the 90s, Vanessa had told her father. Richard hadn't argued. He'd simply said, go meet him. If you come back and tell me no, I'll carry that weight myself. It was the word weight that got to her. Not guilt. Richard Caldwell didn't trade in guilt. It was the image of her father, 72 years old, carrying a dead man's hope to his own grave. That was what made her sit at the kitchen island past midnight searching online for a man who barely existed in the digital world. Henry Thompson had no social media, no LinkedIn profile, no digital presence beyond a business listing for Thompson Custom Woodwork, with a disconnected phone number and 2 5-star reviews from customers who described him as honest and meticulous. In Vanessa's world, where every person she'd ever dated had a curated online presence and a publicist on speed dial, Henry Thompson was practically invisible. The last man who'd wanted to marry her had been a hedge fund manager. Harvard-educated, eloquent, devastating in a tailored suit. He'd proposed on a yacht in Monaco, and 3 weeks later she'd discovered he'd been siphoning her investment capital into his failing startup. She'd ended it with lawyers and non-disclosure agreements, and afterward she'd stopped believing that anyone could want her without wanting what she had. But this man in the photograph, this carpenter with sawdust on his jeans and a disconnected phone number, he didn't even know she existed. He wasn't performing. He was just standing on a crooked porch holding his daughter. By Thursday, Vanessa had made her decision. She would go to Detroit, but she wouldn't go as herself. No black car, no driver, no entourage. She'd go as a woman with nothing someone ordinary enough to be invisible because she wanted to see who Henry Thompson was when money wasn't in the room. She called Diana Brooks, her executive assistant, and told her to clear the schedule for a month. Diana's voice climbed an octave. The Shanghai conference is in 2 weeks. The board review is handle it. Vanessa, where are you going? She looked at the photograph one last time. The little girl wore a yellow dress slightly too big, and she was smiling at whoever held the camera with the uncomplicated trust that only children possess. Somewhere new, Vanessa said, and hung up. The east side of Detroit smelled like cut grass and exhaust fumes. Vanessa stepped off the city bus, her first bus ride in over a decade, wearing thrift store jeans, a gray hoodie, and sneakers that had cost her $12. Her suitcase was small and scuffed, borrowed from Diana's garage. She'd left her rings in the penthouse safe. Without them, her hands looked strangely bare, like a room stripped of furniture. The neighborhood unfolded in contradictions. Some houses stood firm, with trimmed hedges and flags on the porch. Others slumped under decades of neglect, windows boarded driveways splitting open like old scars. A barber shop on the corner pushed Motown through a propped-open door. Two elderly men played dominoes on a folding table outside a laundromat, their laughter threading through the afternoon heat. Vanessa had memorized Henry's address from satellite images. The grocery store was 3 blocks south, and that's where she went first. Not because she needed food, but because patterns are predictable, and a single father with a young child buys groceries often. She was pretending to study a row of cereal boxes when she saw him. He was taller than the photograph had suggested. 6'2", maybe 6'3", with shoulders that looked shaped by years of lifting timber and driving nails. He wore a plain white t-shirt, carpenter jeans still dusted with sawdust at the knees, and work boots so worn they'd lost their original color. His daughter sat in the cart legs, swinging, narrating a story about a caterpillar she'd found at the park. "Daddy, if I keep it, will it turn into a butterfly?" "It might, baby girl. But butterflies need to be free. That's what makes them special. Like you." Henry smiled, not the polite, guarded kind that Vanessa had seen men wear in boardrooms. This one started in his eyes, warm and unguarded, and spread slowly, exactly like me. Vanessa stood behind a shelf of canned tomatoes, gripping a can she had no intention of buying, and felt something shift in her chest. There was a tenderness in this man that seemed almost stubborn, as if the world had spent years trying to knock it out of him, and he'd simply refused. Then a store clerk, name tag reading Gary, approached Henry at the checkout counter. "Back again? Didn't you just buy groceries a few days ago?" Henry placed a carton of milk and a bag of apples on the counter. "My daughter drinks a lot of milk." Gary glanced at Lily, then dropped his voice to a volume that still carried. "Must be rough doing this solo. You ever think about finding that girl a mother? Kids need stability." The words landed with casual cruelty, the kind that pretends to be concern. Vanessa watched Henry's jaw tighten. She watched his hand move to rest on Lily's back, instinctive, protective, a wall built from skin and bone. "She has stability." Henry said, his voice even and clear. "She has me." He paid in exact change, bills, and coins counted carefully, then lifted Lily onto his hip, grabbed the grocery bag, and walked out. No slammed door, no raised voice, just a man carrying his dignity the way he carried his daughter, close, steady, where nothing could reach it. Vanessa set the can of tomatoes back on the shelf. Her hands were trembling, though she couldn't say exactly why. Something about that exchange had cracked open a door she thought she'd sealed shut. Not pity, not admiration, but shame. Shame for every assumption she'd packed into that borrowed suitcase. Shame for the word test that was still sitting in her mind like a business objective on a whiteboard. She found the room through Mrs. Johnson, Dorothy Johnson. Mrs. Johnson, to everyone, honey, and don't you forget it, lived in the lower unit of a duplex 2 doors down from Henry's house. She was 70 years old, widowed, and surrounded by 3 cats, and a collection of ceramic angels that occupied every flat surface in her living room. Vanessa found her through a handwritten "Room for Rent" sign taped to the front window. "I just came from Ohio," Vanessa said, standing on the porch with her suitcase, delivering the story she'd rehearsed on the bus. "Lost my job at a packaging plant. Looking for somewhere affordable while I figure things out." Mrs. Johnson studied her the way a jeweler studies a stone, not suspiciously, but with an expertise born of decades of reading people.
I think it's time.
"You don't look like Ohio, sweetheart."
No, but
"What does Ohio look like?" "Not like someone who stands the way you do, like the whole world is watching and you've been trained to let it." The old woman's eyes softened. but that's your business, not mine. Rent's $400 a month, utilities included. First and last up front. Vanessa paid in cash she'd pulled from an ATM in a neighborhood where no one would recognize her face. Mrs. Johnson handed her a key attached to a wooden keychain shaped like a cardinal. The room was small, a single bed with a lavender quilt that smelled like a grandmother's closet. A window that looked directly into the backyard of Henry Thompson's house. A radiator that clanked through the night like someone tapping a wrench against a pipe. The closet was narrow enough that Vanessa's few thrift store outfits barely filled half of it. That first evening, she sat on the edge of the bed and watched through the window. Henry and Lily were eating dinner at a small kitchen table, macaroni and cheese bright orange, the kind made from a box. Lily was telling a story that involved her whole body arms wheeling, head bobbing, and Henry was listening with the kind of focus that Vanessa had seen CEOs fail to give their own board members. He wasn't checking his phone. He wasn't glancing at a screen. He was simply there completely, as if his daughter's story was the most important thing happening in the world. A knock startled Vanessa from the window. She opened the door to find Lily in dinosaur pajamas, holding a paper plate with 2 cookies on it. "Mrs. Johnson told my daddy you just moved in. He says we always welcome neighbors." She held the plate up with both hands, her expression serious and ceremonial. "These are snickerdoodles. I helped, but Daddy did the hard parts." At the bottom of the stairs, Henry stood with his arms folded. He gave Vanessa a single nod, civil distant, offering nothing beyond basic courtesy. Lily let the lady be. "She's not bothering me." Vanessa knelt to meet the girl's eyes and took the plate. "Thank you, Lily. They look wonderful." "My daddy's the best baker in the whole world," Lily declared with the absolute certainty that only a 5-year-old can carry. Something moved across Henry's face, brief, barely visible, like light shifting behind a curtain. Then it was gone. "Come on, baby girl, bedtime." He took Lily's hand and led her down the stairs without another word. Vanessa stood in the doorway holding a paper plate, listening to their footsteps fade, and the screen door of the house next door swing shut. She sat on the bed and bit into a cookie. It was perfect. Crisp at the edges, soft in the middle, dusted with cinnamon and sugar. Baked by a man who couldn't afford to fix his porch railing, but who taught his daughter that neighbors deserve welcome. She wasn't going back to Chicago. Not yet. Not because her father had asked, and not because of a promise made between 2 men decades ago. She was staying because something in this small, clanking room felt more real than anything in her penthouse ever had. The first week taught Vanessa what money had always shielded her from the texture of ordinary life. She burned rice on Mrs. Johnson's stove and set off the smoke detector so loudly that Henry stepped out onto his back porch to see what was happening. Vanessa waved at him through the haze, embarrassed, and he stared at her for a moment before going back inside without a word. She rode the bus to a temp agency downtown and filled out applications for work she wasn't qualified to do. The woman behind the desk looked at her hands, smooth, uncalloused, manicured down to bare nails, but still unmistakably unused, and asked, "What kind of packaging plant did you say you worked at?" At night she lay on the quilt listening to the radiator clank and the cockroaches move behind the walls. She'd seen a large one on the bathroom floor her second night and had stood on the toilet seat for 10 minutes before killing it with a shoe. In her penthouse, she had a cleaning service that came 3 times a week. Here she was, the cleaning service. But the discomfort wasn't what kept her awake. It was Henry. He existed on the other side of a thin wall of courtesy that he never let anyone cross. He nodded when they passed on the sidewalk. He said, "Morning," if they happened to be outside at the same time. Once, when Vanessa struggled to carry a bag of groceries up the stairs, he took it from her hands, set it at her door, and walked away before she could say thank you. Every gesture was precise, measured enough to be decent, never enough to be personal. Mrs. Johnson noticed Vanessa watching him through the kitchen window one afternoon and set a cup of tea in front of her without being asked. "Don't take it personally, sweetheart. Henry keeps everyone at arm's length. Been that way since Denise left. Vanessa wrapped her hands around the warm mug. Denise. His wife. Ex-wife now. Mrs. Johnson settled into the chair across from her, the way someone settles into a story they've told before, but still feel the weight of. They got married young. Lily came a year later. Beautiful baby. But Denise wanted more than what Henry could give. He was building his carpentry business, working 16-hour days, and she was home with a newborn in a neighborhood that felt like a dead end to her. The old woman shook her head slowly. A man came along. Some real estate developer from the suburbs. Nice car, big promises. Denise was gone before Lily's first birthday, left a note on the kitchen table like she was canceling a subscription. Vanessa felt her stomach tighten. She just walked away from her daughter. People do terrible things when they convince themselves they deserve better. Mrs. Johnson took a sip of her tea. Henry never said a bad word about her, not once. He just picked up Lily, closed the door, and kept going. But something in him shut down that day. At the part that lets you trust another person, she took that with her when she left. Vanessa stared into her tea. Henry's wound was the mirror image of hers. He'd been left because he didn't have enough. She'd been wanted because she had too much. Both of them had learned the same lesson, that love comes with a price tag, and both of them had stopped paying. The thaw began with Lily. It happened on a Thursday, 2 weeks into Vanessa's stay. Henry had taken an extra job, a custom bookcase for a client across town, and Mrs. Johnson mentioned that Lily's school let out at 3:15 with no one to pick her up. "I can get her," Vanessa offered too quickly. Mrs. Johnson gave her a look, the jeweler's look, appraising. "You sure Henry doesn't let just anyone near that child?" She found Henry in his garage workshop that evening, sanding a plank of oak by hand. Sawdust hung in the air like golden fog. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway, his expression the usual neutral mask. "I heard you've got a late job tomorrow," Vanessa said. "I could pick up Lily from school if that helps. Walk her home, make sure she has a snack." Henry set the sandpaper down. He studied her face the way he studied wood grain, looking for flaws, for hidden knots that might split under pressure. "Why?" The question was blunt and honest, and it deserved the same in return. But Vanessa couldn't give him full honesty, so she gave him the piece of it she could. "Because I know what it's like to need help and not want to ask for it." Something shifted behind his eyes. Not warmth exactly. More like the moment a locked door gives a quarter inch. "She gets out at 3:15. Jefferson Elementary, 2 blocks east. She likes apple slices, not juice boxes. And she'll talk your ear off the whole way home." "I can handle that." "I know," Henry said, picking up the sandpaper again. "She told me you're her new best friend. Apparently you rank above the caterpillar now." It was the closest thing to a joke she'd heard from him, and it made her smile all the way back to her room. The next afternoon, Vanessa stood outside Jefferson Elementary with a Ziploc bag of apple slices and a nervousness she hadn't felt since her first board presentation. When Lily burst through the doors and saw her, the girl's face lit up like someone had turned on every light in the building at once. "You came?" Lily grabbed her hand with both of hers. "I told my teacher my neighbor was picking me up, and she said, 'Is she nice?' And I said she's the nicest person after my daddy and Mrs. Johnson." They walked home slowly. Lily talked about her day. A boy named Trevor had stolen her crayon. Her teacher, Mrs. Patterson, had read a book about a bear, and the cafeteria pizza tasted like cardboard. But she'd eaten it anyway because Daddy says we don't waste food. Vanessa listened the way she'd watched Henry listen completely, without checking her phone, without letting her mind drift to the quarterly numbers she'd left behind. When they reached the house, Lily looked up at her with sudden seriousness. "Can you pick me up again tomorrow? If your daddy says it's okay?" Lily squeezed her hand. "He will. He likes you. He just doesn't know it yet." That evening, Henry knocked on Vanessa's door for the first time. He stood on the landing holding a small wooden shelf, simple, clean-lined, sanded smooth. "Your bookshelf is crooked," he said. "The one by the window. I noticed it from the yard. This one's level." He stepped past her, removed the old shelf with a few turns of a screwdriver, and mounted the new one in under 10 minutes. Vanessa leaned against the door frame, watching his hands work, steady, precise, the hands of someone who understood that the things worth building required patience. When he finished, he turned and found her closer than he'd expected. The room was small enough that everything was close, but this felt different. For a half-second, neither of them moved. "Thank you," Vanessa said. "You didn't have to do that." "Crooked shelves bother me. Professional affliction." She laughed, and he almost did. His mouth twitched, his eyes warmed, and then he caught himself like a man reaching for something and remembering it had been moved. "Lily had a good time today," he said from the doorway. "She drew a picture of you. You have purple hair in it. I'm flattered." He nodded once and went downstairs. But that night, for the first time, Vanessa saw him sit on his back porch after putting Lily to bed. He sat in an old wooden chair, one he'd probably built himself, and stared at the sky with the face of someone deciding whether to let the walls down, knowing full well what had happened the last time they did. The drawing lesson started by accident. Vanessa had been sketching in a small notebook, a habit from her college days before business school had replaced art with spreadsheets, when Lily spotted her through the open window. "What are you drawing?" "A bird." "Can you teach me?" Within a week, it became a ritual. Every afternoon after school, Lily sat at Mrs. Johnson's kitchen table with a stack of printer paper and a box of crayons, and Vanessa showed her how to draw animals, flowers, houses with smoke curling from the chimney. Henry came to pick her up one afternoon and stopped in the kitchen doorway. Lily was drawing a butterfly wing spread wide, colored in every shade she had, and Vanessa was leaning over her shoulder, guiding her hand gently. They didn't see him. "The trick is to make the line gentle," Vanessa was saying. "Like you're petting a cat. Not too hard, not too fast." Lily held up the drawing and beamed. "Daddy, look, I made a butterfly, and it's perfect." Henry looked at his daughter's face. Then he looked at Vanessa, and what she saw in his expression wasn't guarded or careful. It was unfiltered, the raw, aching gratitude of a man watching his child be happy in a way he couldn't provide alone. His eyes were bright. His throat moved as he swallowed. He stepped forward, kissed the top of Lily's head, and said, "It's the most beautiful one I've ever seen, baby girl." He looked at Vanessa over Lily's head and mouthed 2 words. "Thank you." Not polite, not measured, just real. That night, Vanessa sat on her bed and cried for the first time since arriving in Detroit. Not from sadness. From the realization that she had come here to test this man, and instead, he had, without trying, without knowing, tested her. Every wall she'd built, every cynic's armor she'd strapped on after Monaco and the lawyers was dissolving in a kitchen that smelled like crayons and apple slices. She wasn't performing anymore. She wasn't evaluating. She was falling, and the ground below was nothing she recognized. The letter arrived on a Monday. Henry brought in the mail while Lily was at school and found the notice from his landlord. Rent would increase from $600 to $1,200 per month effective the 1st of next month. The letter was 1 paragraph printed on cheap paper, utterly impersonal. 30 days to accept or vacate. Vanessa learned about it from Mrs. Johnson, who had received the same notice. "The whole block got them," the old woman said, her voice tight. "Some developer bought the properties. Wants to push everyone out and flip the houses." That evening, Vanessa saw the light in Henry's kitchen stay on long past midnight. She watched as he sat at the small table with bills spread in front of him, a calculator and a yellow legal pad. He wrote numbers, crossed them out, wrote new ones. At one point, he opened the refrigerator, looked inside, and closed it again without taking anything. The next morning, she noticed he'd packed Lily's lunch with a full sandwich, an apple, a juice box, and 2 cookies. His own lunch, sitting on the counter as he headed to a job, was a single piece of bread folded in half with peanut butter inside. He was cutting his own meals to make sure his daughter didn't notice a thing. Vanessa stood in Mrs. Johnson's kitchen gripping the edge of the counter and felt a fury she hadn't experienced since the Monaco betrayal. But this fury wasn't directed at a person. It was directed at the obscene unfairness of a world where a man this good could lose his home over a piece of cheap paper while she could solve the entire problem with a single phone call. One call to her accountant. $1,200 was less than what she spent on flowers for her penthouse each month. But she couldn't make that call. Not without revealing everything. Not without destroying the fragile, precious thing growing between them. For the first time in her life, Vanessa's wealth wasn't power. It was a cage. Diana called on a Wednesday afternoon while Vanessa was sitting on Henry's back porch helping Lily color a picture. The phone buzzed in her pocket, the emergency number Diana only used for crises, and Vanessa excused herself, walking quickly to the side of the duplex. "The Whitfield acquisition is falling apart," Diana said without preamble. "Legal needs your signature on the amended terms. The board wants a call by Friday. Tell legal to use the power of attorney. Tell the board I'll join by phone." "Vanessa, you need to handle the contract language personally. We're talking about a $200 million deal and the liability clause." "Diana, handle it." She hung up and turned around to find Henry standing at the corner of the house. He was holding a glass of lemonade he'd apparently brought out for her, and his face carried an expression she hadn't seen before, alert, watchful, quietly cataloging something that didn't fit. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Fine, just an old friend with drama." She took the lemonade and smiled, but the smile felt thin even to her. Henry held her gaze a beat longer than usual. "You said you worked at a packaging plant in Ohio." "I did." "Funny. I've never heard anyone from a packaging plant talk about liability clauses." Vanessa felt the blood drain from her face. She recovered quickly. Years of boardroom negotiations had taught her to manage her expression under pressure, and laughed. "My friend's going through a divorce. Lawyer's paperwork, you know how it is." Henry didn't push it. He handed her the lemonade, went back inside, and didn't mention it again. But Vanessa noticed that evening that the easy warmth of the past weeks had cooled by 1 degree. A barely perceptible shift like the first night of autumn. The second close call came 4 days later. Vanessa was walking home from the bus stop when a silver Mercedes slowed beside her. The passenger window rolled down and a woman in sunglasses and a silk scarf leaned out. Vanessa Caldwell, my God, is that you?" It was Bridget Collins, wife of a real estate developer, regular at every charity gala Vanessa had attended in the past 5 years. Vanessa turned her face away, pulled her hood up, and kept walking. "I'm sorry, you must have me confused with someone else," she said, without stopping, her heart hammering against her ribs. The Mercedes lingered for a moment, then pulled away. Vanessa ducked into the laundromat and stood between 2 dryers, breathing hard until she was sure the car was gone. When she got home, Henry was on his front porch with Lily, and he watched her hurry up the stairs with the hood still pulled tight around her face. He didn't say anything, but Vanessa could feel his questions accumulating like storm clouds, the overheard phone call, the unfamiliar vocabulary, the way she held herself, and now this quiet patient waiting for the moment they'd break. Her father called that night. Richard's voice was calm but firm. "It's been 3 weeks, Vanessa. James Thompson's son deserves to know the truth. This isn't fair to him." "I know." "Then come home. We'll arrange a proper meeting." The right way would have been not lying to him in the first place. Vanessa closed her eyes. "I need more time, Dad." "Time for what?" She didn't answer because the truth was something she couldn't say out loud. She needed time to figure out how to be honest without losing everything she'd found. The truth didn't wait for her to be ready. It arrived on a Saturday morning in the form of Diana Brooks, 5'2", immaculate in a navy blazer and heels that had no business on a Detroit sidewalk, marching up to Mrs. Johnson's duplex with a leather portfolio under her arm and the expression of a woman who had reached the absolute end of her patience. Vanessa heard the heels on the porch steps and knew before she even opened the door that her borrowed life was over. "Vanessa, the Whitfield deal closes Monday," Diana's voice carried across the yard. "I need your physical signature on 7 documents, and I am not leaving without it." "Diana," Vanessa grabbed her arm and pulled her inside. "Keep your voice down." But it was too late. Henry was in his front yard fixing a loose step on the porch. Lily was beside him holding nails in a coffee can. They were close enough to hear everything. He looked up. Vanessa saw the exact moment recognition landed not of Diana, but of the name. Her real name. Spoken with the deference and urgency that only an employee uses with a boss. She could see it connecting in his mind the name, the phone call about the liability clause. The woman in the Mercedes, every detail he'd been quietly storing for weeks. He set the hammer down slowly. "Lily," he said, his voice steady. "Go inside and wash your hands. I'll be right there." Lily looked between her father and Vanessa, sensing the shift the way children sense weather. She went inside without arguing. Henry crossed the yard. He stopped at the bottom of Mrs. Johnson's stairs and looked up at Vanessa, who stood in the doorway with Diana behind her, and the distance between them, 15 feet of cracked concrete, felt like the width of the ocean. "Who are you?" he asked. Vanessa's mouth opened, but Diana answered first, confused and oblivious. "I'm sorry. Are you a neighbor? I need to speak with Ms. Caldwell privately about it." Caldwell. Henry repeated the name like he was turning a piece of wood in his hands, examining it for rot. "As in Caldwell Industries." Diana looked at Vanessa. Vanessa looked at Henry, and the silence between them held the weight of every drawing lesson every evening on the porch, every moment he had allowed himself to trust a stranger in a gray hoodie who said she came from Ohio. "My name is Vanessa Caldwell," she said. Her voice didn't break, but something behind it did. "My father is Richard Caldwell. He and your father made an agreement 23 years ago. I came here because he asked me to meet you. And I lied about who I was because I wanted to see who you were without the money getting in the way." Henry didn't move. His face went through something Vanessa would never forget, a sequence of emotions so raw that watching it felt like witnessing a private wound. Surprise, comprehension, and then worst of all, recognition. The look of a man who had seen this before. So this was a test. His voice was low and even, which was worse than shouting. "The whole thing, Ohio, the packaging plant, picking up my daughter from school, all of it was you deciding whether I was good enough. Henry, my ex-wife left because I wasn't rich enough for her." He took a step back as if proximity to Vanessa had become something dangerous. "And you showed up pretending to have nothing so you could watch the poor man perform. See if the charity case passed inspection." The words were precise and devastating, delivered without heat, which made them cut deeper. Vanessa felt each one land like a nail-driven flush. "That's not what this was," she said, and she meant it. But she also knew that it was exactly what it had been at the beginning, before everything changed. Henry shook his head. "I let you pick up my daughter. I let you into my home." His voice finally cracked just barely on the last word. "I was starting to—" He stopped himself. Rebuilt the wall in real time, brick by brick, right in front of her. "I want you gone by tonight." He turned and walked into his house. The screen door closed behind him with a sound that was somehow quieter and more final than any slammed door Vanessa had ever heard. She stood on the porch and felt the architecture of the past 3 weeks collapse around her. Not the lie, not the borrowed clothes or the fake story, but the real thing underneath. The drawing lessons, the lemonade on a warm afternoon, the cookies on that first night, the look on his face when Lily held up a crayon butterfly and called it perfect. She had come here to find out whether Henry Thompson was worth marrying, and now she knew he was worth everything, and she had lost him completely. The penthouse felt like a museum. Vanessa stood in the center of her living room, 3,000 square feet of Italian marble floor-to-ceiling windows, furniture chosen by a designer whose name she could never remember, and felt nothing. The Lake Michigan skyline glittered beyond the glass. The kitchen island was spotless, untouched, holding a vase of white orchids that her cleaning service refreshed every Monday. Everything was immaculate. Everything was empty. She had driven back from Detroit that same Saturday night still wearing the gray hoodie and thrift store jeans, and when the doorman greeted her with, "Good evening, Ms. Caldwell," the name sounded like it belonged to someone she used to know. Diana had tried to talk to her in the car, about the Whitfield deal, about the board, about the documents that still needed signatures. Vanessa had signed them at a rest stop outside Ann Arbor, leaning on the hood of Diana's rental car, her handwriting shaky for the first time in her professional life. She hadn't spoken another word for the remaining 2 hours of the drive. Now she stood in her penthouse surrounded by everything money could buy and understood with brutal clarity that none of it mattered. For 3 weeks, she had eaten boxed macaroni and cheese, slept under a second-hand quilt, and listened to a 5-year-old explain why caterpillars deserve respect. And those 3 weeks had contained more warmth than this penthouse had held in all the years she'd lived here. She picked up her phone and called her father. "It's over," she said. "I ruined it." Richard listened as she told him everything. When she finished, the line was quiet for a long time. "Do you love him?" Richard finally asked. The question hit her like cold water. She opened her mouth to deflect, to qualify, to do what she always did when emotions got too close. But the words that came out were simple and unguarded. "I don't know if I'm allowed to call it that yet. But what I feel for him and Lily, it's the realest thing I've ever had, and I threw it away." "Then don't let the mistake be permanent," her father said. "Your mother, God rest her, she always told me the same thing. It's not about never failing. It's about what you do while the other person is deciding whether to forgive you." In Detroit, Henry Thompson was not deciding anything. He was surviving. He went back to work the Monday after Vanessa left, sanded wood, measured cuts, installed a set of kitchen cabinets for a client in Dearborn. He drove home, made dinner for Lily, read her a story, put her to bed. The routine was the same as it had been before Vanessa arrived. But the house felt different, quieter in a way that had nothing to do with sound. Lily asked about her on the second night. "Where did she go, Daddy?" Henry was washing dishes, his back to her, his hands stilled under the running water. "She had to go home, baby girl." "When is she coming back?" "I don't think she is." Lily was quiet. Then, in the voice of a child processing something too large for her, "Did she leave like Mommy did?" Henry turned off the faucet. He dried his hands on a dish towel, walked to the table where Lily sat with her crayons, and knelt beside her. "No, sweetheart, it's different." He didn't have an answer that a 5-year-old could understand because he barely understood it himself. Vanessa hadn't left the way Denise had, out of selfishness chasing something shinier. She'd been sent away. By him. Because the truth she'd hidden was too close to the wound Denise had left, and when the stitches tore open, he'd done the only thing he knew how to do, close the door. But late at night, sitting on the back porch in the wooden chair, Henry replayed every moment. The way Vanessa had listened to his daughter's stories with her whole body. The way she'd guided Lily's hand on the crayon, gentle and patient. The way she'd looked at him the evening he'd mounted the new shelf, not with pity, not with evaluation, but with something soft and startled, like someone seeing sunlight after a long time indoors. She had lied. That was true. But had she lied about everything Mrs. Johnson found him on that porch on a Wednesday evening, a week after Vanessa's departure. She brought 2 cups of tea, handed him one without asking if he wanted it, and sat in the folding chair beside him. "You look like a man fighting himself," she said. "I'm fine, Mrs. Johnson." "Didn't ask if you were fine. Said you look like a man at war with his own heart, and from where I'm sitting, the heart is winning." She blew on her tea. "That girl lied to you. I know that. She came here under false pretenses, and that was wrong. But Henry, I watched her with Lily for 3 weeks. I watched her burn rice and ride the bus and sit on my kitchen floor drawing pictures with a child who isn't hers. Whatever she was when she got here, that's not what she was when she left." Henry stared at the yard. The grass needed cutting. The porch step he'd been fixing on Saturday was still half done, the hammer lying where he'd set it down. "My father used to say something," he said quietly. "He said trust is like wood. You can sand it smooth, stain it beautiful, make it last 100 years. But once it cracks, you can't unfill the crack. You can only build something new around it." Mrs. Johnson nodded. "Your father was a wise man. So let me ask you what he'd ask. Are you going to spend your life staring at the crack? Or are you going to pick up the wood and build?" He didn't answer, but he didn't go inside either. He sat on that porch until the stars came out holding a cup of tea that had long gone cold and let the question sit beside him like a guest he wasn't ready to welcome, but couldn't turn away. Vanessa came back to Detroit on a Saturday morning 2 weeks after she'd left. She did not arrive in a black car. She did not bring lawyers or documents or any symbol of the world she came from. She wore the same gray hoodie and thrift store jeans, not as a costume this time, but as a choice. She carried nothing except herself and the truth. But before she went to Henry's house, she made a phone call. The developer who had bought the properties on Henry's block was a mid-level firm called Greystone Capital. Vanessa didn't buy the properties back. That would have been the Billionaire's solution, and she wasn't here as a billionaire. Instead, she called the managing partner and proposed an investment. Caldwell Industries would fund renovations for the entire block, roofing, plumbing, electrical, in exchange for a 5-year rent freeze at current rates for all existing tenants. The developer kept ownership and got improved property values. The residents kept their homes. It took 40 minutes to negotiate. The managing partner agreed before lunch. Vanessa hung up and sat in her parked car for a long time. The deal would help everyone on the block, not just Henry. He would never know she was behind it unless she told him. And she wouldn't tell him because this wasn't about proving she could fix things with money. It was about making sure that the community he'd built his life in would still be there whether he forgave her or not. She found Henry's house at noon. The front step was fixed new wood, freshly sanded, the nail heads countersunk flush. She walked up and knocked on the door. Henry opened it. He wore a flannel shirt, the same one from the photograph her father had shown her what felt like a lifetime ago, and his expression was unreadable. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, filling the doorframe, waiting. "I'm not here because my father sent me," Vanessa said. Her voice was steady, though her hands were not. "I'm not here because of the promise between our families. I'm here because of a promise I made to myself and to Lily, even if she doesn't know it." Henry's jaw tightened, but he didn't close the door. "I was wrong," she continued. "I came here to test you, and that was cruel. And I won't pretend it was anything else. But somewhere between the first evening you fixed a shelf I didn't ask you to fix, and the afternoon your daughter held up a drawing and called it perfect, I stopped testing and started belonging. I've never belonged anywhere, Henry. Not in the boardrooms, not in the penthouses. The closest I've ever come was a small room with a clanking radiator next door to a man who teaches his daughter that butterflies need to be free." She swallowed hard. "I can't undo the lie, but the person who picked up Lily from school, who sat on your porch, who laughed at your jokes, that was me. The real one. The only version of me that I've ever actually liked." Henry looked at her for a long moment. His eyes held everything, the anger that hadn't fully faded, the wound that Denise had left, and Vanessa had reopened, and beneath all of it something stubborn and green, pushing up through the wreckage like a vine through cracked pavement. He stepped back and closed the door. Vanessa stood on the new porch step alone and felt the rejection settle into her chest. She didn't leave. She sat down on the step, resting her elbows on her knees, and looked out at the street where she'd arrived over a month ago with a borrowed suitcase and a lie. She sat there for an hour. Then the screen door opened behind her, small footsteps, and suddenly Lily was there, throwing her arms around Vanessa's neck with a force that nearly knocked them both off the step. "You came back?" Lily's voice was muffled against Vanessa's shoulder. "I knew you'd come back. I told Daddy. I told him every single day." Vanessa held the girl, this child who owed her nothing, who had given her everything, and let the tears fall without making a sound. The screen door opened again, heavier footsteps. Henry came out and stood behind them. Vanessa looked up at him, Lily still wrapped around her neck, and saw that his eyes were red. He didn't say a word. He sat down on the step beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and stared out at the same street. The three of them sat like that for a long time. A carpenter, a billionaire in a gray hoodie, and a 5-year-old in dinosaur pajamas who had decided with the unshakable certainty of childhood that this was her family. Henry spoke first. His voice was rough, barely above a whisper. "I'm not going to pretend it doesn't hurt." "I know," Vanessa said, "and I'm not going to move fast." "I know." He looked at her. Really looked not through the lens of betrayal, not through the memory of Denise, but at the woman sitting on his porch step with his daughter in her arms, and no armor left. "Lily drew a picture of you every day you were gone," he said. "Purple hair, every single one." Vanessa laughed, a wet, broken, beautiful sound. "I'll have to dye it. Can't disappoint her." The corner of Henry's mouth lifted. Just barely. Just enough. They didn't kiss. They didn't make promises. They sat on a porch step in a neighborhood on the east side of Detroit, watching the afternoon light move across the street, and let the silence between them be something new. Not the silence of distance, not the silence of walls, the silence of two people who had been broken in different ways, sitting close enough to begin. They built it slowly, the way Henry built everything, with patience, with care, with an understanding that the things worth having don't come fast or easy. He didn't call her a billionaire. She didn't call him a project. They were just Henry and Vanessa, learning each other honestly for the first time, without costumes or pretenses or promises made by other people in other decades. And in a small house with a freshly fixed porch step, a little girl with a box of crayons drew a family, a tall man, a woman with purple hair, and herself in the middle, holding both their hands. She taped it to the refrigerator and declared it finished. It was the most beautiful thing any of them had ever seen. You know, sometimes the people we're afraid to let in are the ones who end up changing everything. Vanessa walked into Henry's life wearing a disguise, but ended up discovering the truest version of herself. And Henry, a man who'd sworn never to trust again, found something worth breaking that promise for. If this story made you feel something, I'd love to hear about it. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever judged someone before you really knew their story? And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next one. Every story on this channel is a reminder that love doesn't care about your zip code, your bank account, or your past. It only cares about what you're brave enough to give. I'll see you in the next one.